Because if someone who doesn't have it gets early intervention, big deal, okay? It's not like it's surgery, okay? But if someone who does have it doesn't get it, that could be a potential issue. In terms of acquiring autism later in life, there's a subset of individuals with autism who are sometimes referred to as having regressive autism, who appear to develop typically up to about the age of 2 or 3, and then regress. It's one of the issues that's often cited when people talk about vaccines, that, well, he got these vaccines around this time and he showed regression. But even going back to the original article identifying autism, 1943, Leo Kanner's article, he talked about these kids who showed development and then regression. So it's always been part of the autism diagnosis. In terms of acquiring it later in life, there's no research, and I don't believe that there's any indication that you can. What does happen, though, from time to time, is that adults with an Asperger's syndrome label, because we only got the diagnosis in 1994, so there were a whole lot of people floating around before that who were labeled, like one of my friends was labeled tone deaf. He got a tone deaf diagnosis, which I didn't even know was a real diagnosis, but he has a piece of paper that says tone deaf. But they usually were labeled learning disability, or they were labeled mental retardation, or they were labeled emotionally disturbed, or the earlier diagnoses going back to 1943 were childhood schizophrenia. So there was there's a whole bunch of diagnostic confusion with older adults, so they may come to their diagnosis later. And my experience, the adults that get their diagnosis later are thrilled to get their diagnosis, because now the world makes sense. They weren't lazy, they weren't stupid, they weren't, arrogant, they had a neurological disorder that made it hard for them to do this. So I hope that answered your question.
Doctor, you didn't say this in so many words, but I got the impression your contention is that autism has always been with us in about the same proportion, even though we didn't diagnose it before. Nothing's changed in terms of the frequency.
Mike, I believe that autism is probably at the same rate that it was before, yes, but it wasn't diagnosed. Go back just to 1950, and we routinely institutionalized kids with any significant learning challenge. Okay, and there's some data coming out of the UK right now where they went into institutions, where they went into these large developmental centers that housed adults who were diagnosed many, many years ago. And they're finding numbers similar to what we're talking about today. Now, it's very difficult to do retrospective diagnoses. It's very, very difficult. But I do think that if we do that, we're going to find comparable numbers. Now, one thing I do want to add is that we could take all those things that I said, diagnostic substitution, increasing the diagnosis, autism, greater awareness. My sense is, and this is just my sense, that probably doesn't explain all of it. That there's probably a fourth factor that we have yet to identify. I have no idea what that fourth factor will be. I know it's not diapers. I know it's not a number of other things. But I think research, which is the beauty of research, will lead us to this other factor that may actually be impacting some of the new diagnoses that we're not getting. The greatest number of new diagnoses that are often cited are these kids who in 1994 we first identified. And before that, they were just learning disabilities. They had a learning disability. So I think there's still a fourth factor, but I think 90% is explained by other issues.
Dr. Gerhardt, first off, what is your diagnosis for, say, the Rain Man? And secondly, what is the definition of Asperger's syndrome?
Rain Man is, first of all, Dustin Hoffman was amazing. I'll give him credit. I came out of that movie thinking that was really good, But one thing, the character Raymond, he had multiple savant skills, like he could count cards and he could do phone books and he could do all that sort of stuff. Individuals who are savants, who have that ability, by and large tend to have one savant skill. So if you can count cards, that's about what you can do. You don't have multiple sort of hidden talents. The exception that sort of proves the rule is a young man. Well, he's my age, so of course he's a young man, named Kim Peek, who was one of the models for Rain Man, who actually has multiple savant skills. He's a very interesting guy. He does speak with his father, so if you ever get a chance to see him speak, and he carries the Oscar that Dustin Hoffman got for Rain Man. Dustin Hoffman gave him the Oscar, so you'd actually get to like hold, and they're heavy, which I didn't realize. So I think that character would get a diagnosis of autism, but I also think he's an example of someone who was institutionalized that wouldn't have gotten diagnosed early in life. Okay, Asperger's syndrome is on this sort of far end of the autism spectrum. Was first identified by Hans Asperger back in 1944, but it didn't make it into sort of general thinking in terms of psychiatry or psychology at the time, because Hans Asperger was an Austrian psychiatrist, and much of what was published in Austrian psychiatry in 1944 wasn't really made into didn't make it out of Austria. Okay, well, yeah, it made it into Germany, but that's about it, which it was part of. But yeah. It was only in 1980s when Uta Frith, out of the UK, really translated his work, and we started to talk about this issue of Asperger's syndrome. And it is this very high-functioning group of people. Their language is relatively straightforward. Their cognition appears relatively straightforward, but their understanding of communication and social skills often falls very short. And the best example I can give you, a colleague of mine has a client, an adult woman with Asperger's syndrome, 22 years old, in her junior year of college, got pregnant, okay? Very capable woman. She's in college. She's doing well in college, got pregnant. When he asked her, how did you get pregnant? Weren't you using any contraceptives? She said she thought she was. And he said, well, what were you using? She said, well, my mother always told me I couldn't get pregnant until I got married. Therefore, I thought I couldn't get pregnant. Now, if you're a concrete learner, if you understand language very concretely, my mother told me I couldn't get pregnant until I got married means what? Not being married is effective birth control. Plus, add to that, she had no sexuality education to sort of counter that. And you could, now, a typical individual, not on the spectrum, would have picked up all the other sexuality stuff just by hanging out, just by talking to people, just by having friends, just by being, where most of us got most of our sexuality information. But because she didn't, she ended up in this particular situation. So it's this very capable group of individuals. Oftentimes people say Albert Einstein or, like I said, Bill Gates or Stevens. Like, there are all these people who the Asperger's community tries to diagnose now so that they're part of the, but real diagnoses are a little bit different. So, but that's what Asperger's syndrome is.
Dr. Gerhardt, is there a distribution across the country of autism, or is there hot spots, or is this something that's generally uniformly distributed? There
are definitely clusters across the country of autism. Brick, New Jersey is probably the most famous cluster. By the way, the military could be considered a cluster. We're 1 in 100. Military is about 1 in 74 or 1 in 77, I believe. We don't know why that might be. It may have to do with the age cohort that generally joins the military. There may be other issues, but however, that doesn't in and of itself mean that there are pockets that cause more autism, because random distributions are sometimes messy.